All right, good morning, everyone, and great to see everyone back on our third day of the forum. We went right into it in our informal networking, continuing the conversation, and looking forward to what's to come today. Just as introductions, in case you're new to our forum today, I'm Maureen Kalman, facilitator with SAC State Consensus and Collaboration Program, and part of the team along with Tommy Emonson and Megan Wiley, who are all behind the scenes supporting the forum. So I want to thank the team. Also, just another shout out to our planning team, our UC Davis students, CDFS staff, and DWR staff all help put together this great agenda, great program, great speakers, and really excited about the conversation we've been having and continuing to have. On the next slide, I just want to go quickly through some logistics. If you still having any technical issues, please chat Tommy for assistance. In your name, we ask that in your Zoom name, please include your affiliation as well, so we know who you are. Part of the forum is really about making connections, and it's great to see who is all on the call. And I think everybody's muted, so that's great. On the next slide, just to highlight some of the ways that we were hoping to try and mimic what we would have liked to have, which is a forum in person where we really connect with each other. So feel free to use the hand raise function in the participant panel to get into conversation, add comments and questions in the chat as you hear presentations. As we did yesterday, we are using the Zoom polls to do a quick snapshot through multiple choice questions. And we're using the Mentimeter to get more comprehensive input. So this is where you can actually put in your ideas and thoughts in response to a question that our presenters bring up. And we are going to have a Zoom breakout session today. The purpose of the breakout is to have just informal time. These are not facilitated or comments tracked. It's really just for you to have some time with other participants in the forum. A reminder that we do have on-demand content with presentations and more detailed information that participants have posted. And we're not going to have a happy hour today. We're going to end at 3:30. But we did have amazing happy hour sessions the last couple of days where we really had opportunities to continue discussions and hear from everyone. So thanks for joining. And here is our sponsors. Really appreciate the Almond Board, CBAC Eco Engineering, Graham Fogg for really providing contributions to allow for sponsorships for students and tribal participations, and great to have that. And with that, I'm going to introduce very quickly. We have actually a recording from Paul Goslin, who's the DWR's Deputy Director of Statewide Groundwater Management, and Tommy is going to play his opening remarks.
I'm Paul Goslin. I'm Deputy Director for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office at DWR. What I'd like to do today is give you an update on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program and its relationship to FloodMark. As you know, surface water has been regulated for over 100 years in California, and it wasn't until 2014 that the new law, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, was put in place that for the first time would regulate groundwater on a statewide basis, linking both surface water and groundwater as an integral part of California's water supply portfolio. Groundwater is critically important for all of California. And as you've seen, the drivers, particularly through the drought, but in other years, many of our basins have been over-exercised to the point that we've started to see problems associated with land subsidence, water supply unreliability, and disconnection with interconnected creeks and streams. So the 2012 to 2016 drought was one of the drivers that led to the development of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. That was one of the more severe droughts that we've had, and what happened was some of the groundwater management in some areas that were over-exercising the basin were really exacerbated during the drought. We saw increased land subsidence, groundwater reliability issues, and disconnection of creeks and streams. So the law for the first time was put in place in 2014. DWR was tasked to be the primary regulatory agency to implement SGMA. We were tasked with developing regulations, and those were enacted in 2016. Now in 2017, there was a deadline for local agencies to be formed, groundwater sustainability agencies, as they're called in the Act, to be developed in each one of the basins to cover the entirety of the basin. And by June 30th, there were over 250 agencies formed. Some of them are existing agencies, local water districts or counties or municipalities, but others were new agencies where local agencies got together through joint powers agreements or other agreements and formed new agencies that really engaged the public to get on the task of developing groundwater sustainability plans to ensure sustainability for the basins within 20 years. Now, for the timeline, groundwater sustainability plans in critically overdrafted basins had to be submitted by 2020. And that was the first round of groundwater sustainability plans that was submitted to the department. Now, we had 2 years under the law to review groundwater sustainability plans. So we had until January of 2022 to review those submitted plans. But once those agencies submitted those plans in 2020, they were off to the races and began implementation of those plans, which are continuing today. Now, our first decisions that were released in June were on 4 basins. And this is where the first round, these were single groundwater sustainability agencies that had a single plan in these basins. And what we found that through a thorough analysis of all the requirements of the plans, that 2 of the plans, the Santa Cruz Mid-County Basin and the 180 400-foot aquifer subbasin, met the requirements of the law and the regulations, and we are deemed those plans approved. But we also include suggested improvements and corrective actions to those plans that those agencies could employ. There were 2 other basins that we reviewed that had deficiencies that precluded us from approving the plans. Now, we notified them in June to give them an early idea about what those deficiencies were, and they had to consult with us before our final assessment in January. Now, if they're not able to complete those deficiencies in January, we'll deem them incomplete, and they'll have 180 days to reconcile those. Now, the initial findings that we found, getting these plans based upon the regulation guidelines, is that eliminating overdraft is central to SGMA, but not the only requirement. We do need to make sure that those plans avoid undesirable results to the development of the sustainable management criteria. And this gets into the concept in the law about how sustainability is defined. It wasn't defined as what sustainability is. It was defined by what we want to avoid. And what we want to avoid is undesirable impacts to groundwater uses and users from 6 indicators. And the 6 indicators are lowering groundwater levels, reductions in storage, seawater intrusion, degraded water quality, land subsidence, and surface water depletion. Now, each one of these indicators has to be evaluated about where they are going to sustain the basin and how groundwater uses and users are affected by those indicators. And again, they have 20 years to implement and achieve sustainability. And along the way, there's regulatory check-ins every 5 years to see that they're on track based upon their own development of the sustainable management criteria to make sure they're on track and achieving their target towards sustainability. And what we're looking at doing that is setting operational levels called measurable objectives where the basin should be in 20 years, but also identifying minimum thresholds that would indicate unsustainability conditions for the basin. Now, one of the things we found was some of the plans needed to better identify undesirable results. And really that gets into doing a lot more analysis and a lot more consideration about all the different groundwater uses and users, which are listed here on the slide, which run the range of everything from domestic wells, ag wells, public systems, groundwater dependent ecosystems. The other key piece is engagement of stakeholders, and that's also listed here too. One of the key aspects of SGMA, it did set a very high bar for community engagement, and we look very closely at how those agencies are engaging the public. Now again, one of the other findings we had was the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives, which is at the heart of sustainability, was making sure that those justifications for where they set minimum thresholds is documented and the work is done to do the full evaluation. Now, one of the things that we found is not all the plans fully evaluated and disclosed all the effects on beneficial uses and uses. The other key aspect, and this ties in nicely with the FloodMar program, is the project and management actions. We want to make sure that how they plan on achieving sustainability is tied directly into avoiding undesirable results for groundwater users and users and mitigating overdraft. So all these pieces, not just where they want the basin to be, but have they demonstrated the means to get there through project and management actions is documented in the plan. The plans were very detailed in many respects, but we did find that a number of plans did have deficiencies that really didn't clearly articulate how they were going to get to sustainability and whether they've fully considered all the groundwater uses and users and whether the basin, when it achieves sustainability as they project, would avoid undesirable results for those uses. So the timeline, and this is the initial step we've had with critically overdrafted basins that have been submitted in 2020. We also have the other high and medium priority basins that are slated to submit their plans to the department by January of 2022. Now, again, we'll have 2 years to review those plans as they come in and come out with similar process on providing staff evaluations of those plans in advance of our final assessments in the following January. So when those plans are evaluated, they're either going to be acceptable or deemed incomplete with certain deficiencies, and they'll be given 180 days to reconcile them. And if they aren't able to reconcile the deficiencies in 180 days, there's a process with the state board where they'll be referred to the state board for intervention. Now, if that process goes, we do expect and encourage and want those GSAs to continue implementing those sustainable practices and the GSP aspects to lead towards sustainability while they reconcile and work with the board on removing the deficiencies. Once plans are approved, they do have to provide the department with 5-year updates along the path towards their 20-year implementation horizon. And these 5-year updates are very important because it provides us another regulatory check-in to make sure that they're on track with what they said they were going to do in the plan, and whether those things that they said they were going to do are actually getting employed and they're actually doing what they expected them to do to reach sustainability. This is important because we're also going to include improvements to the GSPs accordingly to these 5-year updates. We do expect over the course of the implementation that there'll be a continuous improvement process of plans as new data and other circumstances emerge to make sure that the plans, when fully implemented by 2040 and 2042, are going to achieve sustainability given the circumstances at the time, given climate change and changes in land use conditions. Now, one of the things we've found in many of the plans, and I would say even before GSPs, the Sigma went into place, there was a lot of interest on recharge projects and improving water supply conditions, utilizing floodmar type projects before that was coined. But with the enactment of the new regulatory program through Sigma, it really spurred on the interest of floodmar type projects. And we've seen these in many plans being submitted to the groundwater sustainability plans. And as you'll hear later, the important piece of this is the floodmar projects need to align with the GSP projects and management actions. And one of the things we offer, besides being a regulatory agency and reviewing the plans, is also providing technical assistance across the basin. So as you'll hear later, we have a number of tools and assistance to help groundwater sustainability agencies achieve and implement the floodmar projects during the course of the implementation period. Thank you.
All right, thanks Tommy for the video, and Paul for making that connection between floodmar, Sigma as a regulatory context for providing update on the GSPs and long-term implementations, and highlighting the topic that we're going to be discussing this morning around technical, financial, and permitting assistance. If we can go to the next slide, yeah. So we want to check in with everyone on what are your takeaways from day 2. We started this conversation with Jenny Marr at our informal networking, and would love for those who just joined to use the QR code or the link in the chat and add your thoughts. And we do have a few minutes. I want to give people an opportunity to use the hand raise and just share in person what you took away from our conversation yesterday and just in general, the full context of it. So I'll give you a few seconds to see that, and just share that when we started the forum, I talked a little bit about how we are continuing a conversation that we started at the forum a couple of years ago, where at the forum 2 years ago, we identified those 5 key areas that we want to advance on. And here we are 2 years later, doing this check-in with everyone. What have we been doing? What work has been done to advance floodmar implementation? And where we started with connections and network and collaboration, what I'm really hearing in this 2 days is just the importance of outreach and disseminating information. We are rich with information, expertise, and knowledge that we've been hearing about. There's a lot of heart and passion and commitment to this, and how important it is for all that information to be shared widely so it can really make the impact in seeing FloodMAR implementation in the ground. Been great to have this conversation. I'm still looking to see if anybody wants to raise a hand and share your takeaway thoughts. And I see Tommy's putting up the.
I raised my hand. This is Abdul.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Abdul. Thanks for playing along. Yes.
So I want to say something. When I heard yesterday's, various presentations and also the in the afternoon this more open exchange and information. So what struck me, and I'm probably sort of saying what Kamir would have said, that when this process was started a few years ago, and the progress which has been made in terms of improving and understanding what FloodMAR is, then enhancing, developing tools and applying those tools in different pilot projects. And then the way not both, academia, state and local agencies have come forward and sort of embraced this as a viable water management strategy. If someone told me that this much progress would have been done by this time, I would have doubted that. So I think in summary, what I would say that when a concept, when an idea, it has potential and it has the it has the potential to change things for the better. People actually embrace it and people work on it, and this small steps eventually, after a considerable amount of time, in this case 2, 3 or whatever number of years, it starts showing results. So what I am suggesting is this: after yesterday and the day before yesterday, I am very, very optimistic that through this formation of the FloodMAR network and all the things that are happening around it and being showcased in the FloodMAR network forums and other sort of venues, this will ultimately we'll remember these will be our memories that we have all participated in terms of through the FloodMAR network in changing the trajectory of sustainable water management in California. So I left yesterday, and I'm sure I'll have the same feeling today. There is a lot to be optimistic about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Abdul. I think you're reflecting sentiments that are showing up on the screen in terms of really acknowledging the work has been done and the opportunities, and as well as the fact that there's more work to be done moving forward. So I see that. I'm wondering if we had great conversation yesterday in the happy hour time. I'm wondering if, and I'm just going to call in, not to put anybody on the spot, but just to highlight in case you want to share, if Michael, Jenny, or Jim want to share any takeaways from your discussion in the afternoon yesterday. We'd love to hear a couple of things before we move forward. Jenny, I know you were at the Tribal Water Stories. Anything you want to share?
Sorry, I just took a bite of a snack. So apologies, everybody. But yeah, I had the pleasure to participate in the Tribal Water Stories that was hosted by Emily Alejandrino, and Anacita Augustines from DWR's Tribal Advisor Policy or Tribal Policy Advisor. And it was really wonderful to hear the water stories. And, we talk about, needing big collaboration and, coming together to advance flood-mar projects. And I really think, connecting kind of all of this together, foundational to that is we need to be connected to the places that we work in, the places that we formulate projects for. And, if we want to call that caring or whatever, I think having those deep connections to the places that we work, either to the problem, to the solution, to the community, to the landscape, that was really a nice kind of end of the day. Yesterday was so technical, to talk about deep histories that tribal communities have within California and different landscapes within California, and just kind of bringing that lens to our water management perspective was really quite powerful for me.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. It's the human connection to Earth and the fact that we've been given a responsibility as stewards to do things well.
Arit, can I give one last shout out to Abdul? I know he's already shared his thoughts, but he did say something during the Tribal Water Summit that really resonated with people, and I wanted to share it. When we talk about integrated watershed management and watershed scale strategies like flood-mar, he really defined it at the end as connecting land, water, and people. And that really resonated with everyone that was at the happy hour.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Great. Okay, and with that, connecting land, water, and people, I think we're going to move forward to our day today. So I'm just going to quickly go over the agenda. Our morning is dedicated to hearing about resources, guidance, technical support, and funding for landowners and local agencies. We'll have Daniel Mountjoy, who's going to moderate it. We're going to have lunch break from 12:30 to 1, and then invite you with your lunch, so you could be chewing if you need to. For our lunchtime speaker, we have a great program hearing from Dirk Charlie with the Dunlop Mono Tribe on building partnerships and providing tribal liaison perspective. And then at 2 o'clock, we're going to reconvene with Sharon Farrell with the California Landscape Stewardship Network, and just wrap up our forum with coming back to the importance of making connections. And then we have some closing thoughts from CAMIAR and Secretary Karen Ross. And we'd like to hear from you as well, what your wrap up is for the forum. It's been a great time together. And before I introduce Daniel, I just want to very quickly talk about post-meeting. We've had a lot of people asking about whether we're going to have PowerPoints available, what materials people will have access to post-meetings. And I want to clarify that following the forum, we will be pulling all resources and materials together to share in the network SharePoint. So if you're not part of the network and don't have access to the SharePoint, please reach out to Jenny for that. And what we will be sharing in the network SharePoint are going to be recordings from the 3 days. We are going to be working on developing an outcome summary from the forum, so we'll have that. We should have a list of moderators and presenters with contact information. Really want to encourage participants to reach out directly to presenters that they heard from if you want to continue conversation or learn more about what people are doing. And we will ask our presenters if they are able to share PowerPoints to include in our SharePoint. So that will be coming in the next few weeks for you. So just wanted to share that information. And I think with that, I'm done with the logistics and we can get into our great conversation. And we'd like to introduce Daniel Mountjoy, who I've had a chance to work with as part of the Research Advisory Committee, which he co-chaired. And so Daniel leads Sustainable Conservation's Water for the Future program to support groundwater sustainability through collaboration with farmers, researchers, and agencies. Daniel directs work on field testing and monitoring groundwater recharge on active farmland, developing groundwater recharge decision support tools for farmers and water management agencies, and informing policy decisions to ensure that the business, community, and environmental aspect of water reliabilities are considered. And you can find a more comprehensive bio of Daniel, but I think many of you know Daniel, and I want to just turn it over to you so we can get going with our conversation.
So much, Harit. So this is our fifth theme from the forum, and it's actually quite a mouthful. This session, it includes guidance and technical support and funding for landowners and local agencies. Each of those really deserves a section on its own. I worked for 17 years before joining Sustainable Conservation at the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we did develop guidance and technical support and funding for land conservation practices. And each of these were, in fact, entire subjects of much knowledge and development. The FLEDMAR RAC spelled out the need for a variety of approaches to inform and support the FLEDMAR concept. And of the 39 priority actions that rose to the top in that process and were included in the research and data development plan, almost half of them, 18, were recommendations for development of tools, guidance, and protocols. And the distinction that really came out of the RAC was they envisioned that the knowledge and guidance that's needed really, much of that already exists, but is simply not in a form that's accessible to those that are going to actually implement FLEDMAR on the ground and demonstrate, and scale this. The RAC also recognized that that much of the guidance needs to come from on the ground experience, from pilot projects and from research results that are already carried out, and also from existing management experience from those that are practicing FLEDMAR. Yesterday, we heard about some new guidance being developed by Helen Dahlke, and today we're going to hear more about available support for landowners and agencies. And I'm just really excited by the fact that we're really moving forward, as Abdul so well stated. There's a lot of work going on. There's a lot of progress being made. I also, Abdul, am surprised by how much we've actually already accomplished, and this forum has really been a chance to showcase some of that. Technical assistance is a really important piece of getting the message out to farmers and agencies, and it's going to require consistency and also honesty about the evolving message about what we know. When I think many of us started out a few years ago trying to promote on-farm recharge, we had to acknowledge we didn't know a lot, and that we really were working in collaboration with those that were implementing FLEDMAR type projects. And it's really critical that we're both honest and consistent so that we avoid confusion and the potential inertia that happens when farmers and agencies hear conflicting information and may decide that there's really not enough clarity to move forward. And it's going to be key to demonstrating and scaling FLEDMAR. And I think the network has a key role to play in advancing those kinds of messages. On the financial assistance side that we're going to hear about today, regarding specifically public funding for FLEDMAR project implementation, a lot of the themes that are coming up right now are about whether project applicants have to piece together funding from a variety of different single purpose funding sources. Since FloodMAR engages flood management and groundwater replenishment and habitat enhancement, each of those topics tend to come with funding from different agencies and with different priorities. And it's really, in order to move FloodMAR forward, we need to be thinking of funding programs that reward and target multi-benefit outcomes. Example was Proposition 1 funding a few years ago that needed to demonstrate public benefit, but didn't recognize the public benefits of recharge. And we didn't have the models to show that there were public benefits, such as returning stream flows from recharge. So, prioritizing funding towards multi-benefit is going to be a key piece, and it'll be interesting to hear what our speakers say about that today. And then finally, we're going to hear about regulatory guidance today. And there's been many comments during today or the last 2 days about the regulatory barriers to FloodMAR. Some people have said it's 70% of the effort is getting through the regulatory process. So we're going to learn today from Amanda Montgomery about what that permitting process, what current permitting processes exist, and perhaps identify some areas that new opportunities or options are needed. So the process is that we're going to have 20 minutes for each speaker. There'll be time for a few clarifying questions after each speaker. If you can put your clarifying questions in the chat, I'll pull from those as we have time. And then at the end, we'll have another 25 minutes for questions. And again, you can chat those or ask live on Zoom by raising your hand or come on the screen. And then finally, there'll be a breakout room at noon for further discussion amongst all of you around this. So I'm going to start out by introducing our first speaker. Just want to point out we have 2 speakers from environmental nonprofits, and we have 2 state agencies represented, 2 of the agencies most central to the implementation of SGMA, DWR, and the State Water Board. So our first speaker today is Taylor Broadhead, who will be talking about water quality considerations and guidance that she's been active in developing. And Taylor is my colleague at Sustainable Conservation, and she's a project manager and works on the development of tools to support multi-benefit groundwater recharge, including a very active role in the Merced FloodMAR study. And she uses statistical and geospatial software to analyze and visualize model results and support adoption of best practices. So Taylor, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Daniel. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, you're fine.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about work that Sustainable Conservation has been doing over the last year or so to develop water quality considerations and decision support tools. But first, I think I should give some context to this work. So as I'm sure a lot of you here know, our groundwater use in California is not exactly sustainable, and certain regions of the state are in worse condition than others. And with such a dire situation with groundwater overdraft, a lot of people are looking to groundwater recharge as a solution. And the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC, found that realistically, recharge can make up about 25% of the overdraft in the Central Valley. So I do want to acknowledge that recharge is a really important tool, but I also want to say that it isn't exactly a silver bullet to solve all of our water issues. So there's really a lot of great work going on out there. You've heard about it through this last 3 days, including the land repurposing that EDF is going to talk about here shortly. But here we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into what is really just one tool in the sustainability toolbox, and that's on-farm recharge, or AGMAR. So there are a lot of potential benefits of AGMAR, but there are also a lot of people who are concerned, and justifiably so, because on-farm recharge has the potential to mobilize contaminants and impact drinking water. But there's also potential, to apply enough water during recharge and possibly dilute what is being flushed into the groundwater. So before I get started in covering some of our findings from the work, I'd like to do a quick poll and just kind of gauge where everybody stands on-farm recharge and how big of a risk you think it poses to drinking water quality. And this one has a little bit longer of answers, so you might need to drag the poll.
Yeah, to see the full
To
thing,
see
you have to expand the box size.
Yeah, expand the box size. Thanks, Daniel. Okay. I give it maybe about 15 more seconds. All right, it looks like answers are in, so we can go ahead and end the poll. And most people say, okay, it depends on risk factors associated with site selection. Okay, so we'll unpack that a little bit, and I think that's a good point to go ahead and dive into the work that we've done over the last year to understand the impact of on-farm recharge on water quality. All right. So what we would really like to do is understand, and this was our goal through this whole process, is to understand how recharge can lead to clean drinking water, or at least prevent water quality problems. So there are a lot of different methods, right, of recharge and a lot of different contaminants out there, like pesticides and arsenic. But we focused our work specifically on the potential impact of on-farm recharge on salts, and in particular nitrate. And what I want to say first and foremost is that we did not do this work alone. From critical insights in the exploratory phase to very kindly and generously reviewing every step of the way. We had a lot of help from a lot of individuals, a lot of whom are on this call today, who represent a lot of different perspectives. And this includes academics, scientists, irrigation districts, GSAs and their consultants, environmental justice, conservation, NGOs, government staff, and grower representatives as well. So as you can imagine, with a lot of different stakeholders, there's a lot of different perspectives, and sometimes these viewpoints are conflicting. So we tried our best to address these conflicts by balancing two core principles. One, that the science is the foundation of the work, but we acknowledge that the science is not yet settled. And we also want to keep community concerns front and center. And so the result here is two different documents. There's one, a white paper, and this gives an overview of the most current peer-reviewed literature that forms the scientific foundation of how to protect and possibly even improve water quality while engaging in on-farm recharge. So a big shout out here to Hannah Waterhouse, who's a postdoc from UC Berkeley. She wrote the white paper, and I also want to give a special thanks to Helen Dalka and Thomas Harder, along with many others who so generously provided their input and expertise and review that was really central to this effort. And so from the white paper stemmed the nitrate management brief, and this is a summary of the nitrate specific findings from the white paper. And really it's targeted to growers, water planners, and communities. And the purpose here is so that we can empower these stakeholders to engage in decisions and planning. And so my next slides are going to be focused on nitrate only. One, because it's an urgent human rights issue, but also because salts are generally hard to manage. So one of the findings is something that I'm sure you all know, that nitrate is likely to get worse before it gets better in a lot of places in the Central Valley. And so this is a map that was produced through the CV salts process, and it shows areas in red where nitrate is already exceeding the drinking water quality standard. And these red areas are likely to grow bigger before they diminish, regardless of management actions like recharge. And a lot of this contamination is due to over application of nitrogen fertilizer in prior years and even decades. And given that this nitrate has and is still seeping into the ground, there's going to be ongoing nitrate leaching with and without recharge from below the root zone or the vadose zone. And so one of the most important findings from this research is that the single most important thing that we can do to protect water quality under AgMAR now and into the future is to do our best to try to minimize further nitrate leaching below the root zone. So Irrigated Lands program is hopefully ensuring that growers will adhere to best practices, but the work to practically reduce nitrogen leaching on farms is really not easy, and it's going to take some time, and there's still a lot of room for research and guidance and other tools to be developed. And this figure is one example of some work going on right now to help farmers improve their nitrogen efficiency. And so this figure was from the Almond Board, and some of you might be familiar with it. It's the 4 R's of nutrient management, which is applying nitrate at the right rate, the right time, in the right place, and at the right source. And so for growers who are wondering, how or if I can engage in recharge, we provide field scale considerations to minimize this leaching under AgMAR. So for example, targeting crops with lower nitrate demand. And these considerations can also be useful for GSAs in developing, guidelines and prioritization tools. And for GSAs who, want to look at the cumulative effects of the recharge sites, for example, they can look at groundwater gradients. So recharge and pumping can actually shift groundwater gradients. So it's important to understand this for scenarios where you either want to avoid flushing nitrate toward a well that currently has good drinking water, or if you want to target well to improve access for water for communities. Or in many cases, like what we have in California where water is limited, GSAs could prioritize recharge on fewer sites so that they can better dilute legacy nitrate in soil. And because our water is often limited, we thought it would be a good idea and really useful to include this framework on how we can think about prioritizing sites under AgMAR. So something important that we learned through this work and what this conceptual graph is showing at a high level is that groundwater quality might worsen before it gets better, regardless of whether you do recharge or not. But the time scale on how that can happen can potentially differ with recharge. So we learned that short and long-term potential effects depend on existing water quality and legacy nitrate loading. So what we're showing here is how groundwater quality might change with and without recharge across time. And so this is a scenario where you have medium or high legacy nitrate loading and good existing water quality, which is here on the y-axis. So our starting point, we're here below the maximum contaminant level, which is this red line. And now with recharge shown in this blue band, you might initially flush that legacy nitrate into the groundwater, causing this initial spike, but it's likely to resolve sooner and quicker than in the scenario where you don't have recharge, and that's in that brown band. And you might be wondering why the bands are really thick. And this is because estimating legacy nitrate is not easy. So there is some uncertainty involved in whether or not that nitrate concentration is going to exceed the maximum contaminant level, so bump up above that red line. But it's this situation where we really want to exercise caution, because what we don't want to do is worsen good water quality that's already drinkable. And so we explored another scenario where nitrate concentration in the groundwater is already high. So this time we're starting out above the MCL, and with recharge, we're likely to flush out and dilute that nitrate in the groundwater a lot sooner than in this no recharge scenario with this brown band. So this might be a situation where, regardless of the level of legacy nitrate loading, we might be able to clean up groundwater that's already been contaminated on a shorter time scale than what would have otherwise occurred. And so this framework is also really useful in identifying best sites for monitoring. We know that there's a limited amount of money to go around, and so focusing monitoring on higher risk sites makes sense. And we don't really go too deeply because there's a lot of great resources out there, but we do provide some considerations on monitoring and contingency plans. So for example, establishing a baseline water quality condition before you recharge, or coordinating your monitoring efforts with existing regulatory programs like the IRLP. But if there's one thing that's become super clear to us through this process, it's that communities who might be impacted by recharge activities really need to be included as decision makers, because the short term could mean 10 to 20 years. And while that may not really sound like a lot of time, it is a big impact from the people who are relying on groundwater for drinking water every day. So this work is really meant to be a tool that can help communities, in addition to growers and water managers, make informed decisions about their water future. So collectively, we've been referring to these considerations as version 1.0. And the reason why we're doing that is to acknowledge that there's still a lot of work to be done in solidifying the science and developing tools to support on-farm recharge. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the groundwater recharge assessment tool, or GRAT, that we developed with our partners at Earth Genome. So I will provide a little bit of background on how the tool works, and then briefly touch on some of the work that we did recently with DWR through the Merced Flood-Mar study, which you might have heard about yesterday at the talks. And what I really want to highlight here is that GRAT is currently evolving, and there are possible future avenues for incorporating water quality guidance in the future that we would really like to look into a little more. So one thing to know about GRAT is it was originally designed to help irrigation districts and GSAs identify best sites for groundwater recharge. And you can kind of think water quantity here. So the goal was to increase water quantity by identifying ideal crops and geologic conditions. And this is very much still a central function of GRAT. But the Flood-Mar study, what it did was provide a really unique opportunity to expand this functionality and determine how can we target certain sites so that we can achieve different management outcomes. And in this study, we looked at different management outcomes like ecosystem benefits, but today I'm going to touch briefly on the potential benefits to disadvantaged communities. And so, right, like I said, without getting into too much detail, so GRAT's prioritizing sites on crop suitability and a recharge suitability index that includes soil, geologic conditions, and SAGB. And so this is a map of the Merced irrigation district. And what we're showing is, with these colors, red to green, are different locations that are ideal for recharge. So if you look in the west side of the district here, there's this more green and yellow. And so that means that these sites are generally going to be ranked higher and prioritized first. And the less suitable sites are in the southeastern part of this district. But we might want to put water in areas that are traditionally not ranked as high because they might serve other objectives and other benefits, like for disadvantaged communities, for example. So the way we do this is by changing how the tool prioritizes where to put water. So whereas before it was crops and geologic conditions, if we want to benefit community drinking water, we might want to sequence fields based on population density, well depth, reliance on groundwater, and risk of well dewatering. So now that management objectives have been introduced in GRAT, outside of the Flood-Mar study, we want to explore how we can incorporate this water quality guidance as a management objective in GRAT. So right now, it seems like a first step would be, to look at current land use. That's a good starting point. And what we've learned through our water quality guidance is that there's definitely a real need to reduce nitrate leaching. And one way we can do this is targeting recharge on crops that have lower nitrate demand. So in this situation, we might want to, prioritize crops like grapes or alfalfa. And we could also work with GSAs then to prioritize sites that we know to be practicing good nutrient management. And go back. There we go. So to really put this guidance into action, it would be ideal to incorporate legacy loading and existing water quality, right? So we could kind of model that framework that we went through. But we know that this data is not necessarily easily collected or consistently available to use on a site-specific basis. So in version 2.0, what we'd really like to do is work on building more consensus on what data we can use and how it can be interpreted. And so kind of looking forward to what we're doing for our next steps is definitely trying to include these management area concept for water quality into decision support tools. We're also looking forward to doing more outreach to GSAs, irrigation districts, farmers, and communities. And we also have some exciting work coming up to incorporate this guidance into supporting some recharge program development on the ground. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Taylor. I've not seen any clarification questions, but you've had some good chat comments here, which I think we can bring up probably later on. I might, since there aren't clarification questions, does anybody have a clarification question that they want to add in at this point? Or we can, I think we've got comments about monitoring programs from Kamyar and from Graham, discussion about, I'm sorry, from Graham was monitoring and from Kamyar was about some funding mechanisms, which we'll get to later. So unless anybody has any clarification questions, I think we may go on to introduce our next speaker, who is Anna Schiller from the Environmental Defense Fund. And Anna's going to talk about multi-benefit land repurposing grant program. And Anna is, as I said, is with the Environmental Defense Fund. She's a water program project manager, and she's focused on integrated land and water management through collaborations and partnerships. She's focused on implementing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and multi-benefit land repurposing, and earned her master's degree in water resources management at UC Santa Barbara Bren School. So next slide there, we can get to Anna's.
Hey, Daniel, I'm sorry to interject. In my notes on the flow, I had Tim as being next.
Okay, I sent you a message asking which one was which. So, okay, so let me introduce Tim then.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for confirming that. So next we're going to hear from one of our agency representatives then. Tim is going to be talking about all the topics really on this in this panel, which is data, tools, technical assistance, and funding being provided by the Department of Water Resources. And Tim is supervising engineering geologist at DWR, and he's also the technical and policy advisor to the deputy director of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program. Tim's got more than 20 years of experience working on groundwater and is a licensed California professional geologist and certified hydrogeologist with his master's degree in geology from Northern Arizona University. So Tim, glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I'm the spoiler and diverting off of Anna.
Yeah.
So I appreciate having me here today. Thanks, Daniel, and thank you everybody for participating and chipping in. I'll dive right in. So you'll see if you were on for Paul Gosselin's talk this morning, there's a little bit of redundancy here in slides. So I'm going to move quickly, hopefully putting this more in context of just how Sigma fits in, or how Floodmar and Sigma fit together, and what some of the considerations are in terms of how we meet regulatory compliance and move forward with that. But most importantly, providing the assistance that we are so focused on giving to local agencies. So I'll start from the top and just kind of provide just a high level overview. We're all aware of just how important groundwater is to California in supporting our agricultural economy, our drinking water needs, our environment, and our communities. We rely very heavily on groundwater, and as is evident by some slides that Paul had presented earlier, it represents 40% of our water portfolio in normal years, and 60 maybe +% in drought years like we're experiencing today. I think one of the most telling things is the graphic on the right here, in that this is looking at groundwater levels over the last 20 years. And colors in green and yellow are stable or recovering groundwater levels, rising groundwater levels, and those in orange and red are lowering groundwater levels. So we're seeing decreasing trends over the last 20 years. This is strong evidence that our demand is likely outstripping our supply and is supportive of the overdraft conditions that we've been observing and the impacts that those overdraft conditions have triggered throughout the state. You know, things like subsidence and things like dewatering of wells, dewatering of stream beds even. So our surface water bodies. So SGMA was enacted to address this overdraft and really start to head off some of these issues that have been pervasive and are limiting now our ability to move water throughout the state when it's available. So real quickly, DWR's role in this, we provide two hats. We wear two hats in this system. We provide regulatory oversight in that we are responsible for reviewing the groundwater sustainability plans for being consistent with the Act and the regulations. And then a more traditional role for the department, which is providing assistance. The department has traditionally provided assistance in a number of forms long before SGMA came along. And this is old hat for us, and we're very appreciative to continue to develop these assistance programs, these technical and planning and financial information or financial support that can really help advance us in managing our water resources across the board throughout the state. So I'm very grateful to be here with the FloodMar team and others that have been serving in this capacity for a long time, and really appreciate this team for bringing together all of you great folks to discuss what's still hanging out there, what's needed, and how do we address this collectively together and keep moving forward for a strong California. So SGMA, obviously is really targeting driving towards sustainability, and it specified what sustainability is. Sustainability is operating to a sustainable yield while avoiding 6 undesirable results. Those are lowering of groundwater levels, significant reductions in storage, seawater intrusion, degraded water quality, land subsidence, and depletion of interconnected streams. And it's doing this from the locals' perspective. The locals have the control to define what are significant and unreasonable impacts with regards to these indicators. And their job is to go out and talk with the stakeholders in the basin to understand who are the users and what are the needs on groundwater, so they can define those appropriately that are respective of all the beneficial uses in the basin. And as I highlighted before, DWR's role here is a regulatory and an assistance role. However, where the department finds a plan to be inadequate or not meeting the objectives of the Act and the regulations, or inconsistent with those, our sister agency, the State Water Resource Control Board, has a role in helping take control of these basins, developing interim plans, and returning the control back to the basin, back to the locals once we're back on track. So ultimately, it's still local control. It just might need some help along the way should a plan go to that pathway, and the state board is there to help in that role. So what does a GSP consist of, the groundwater sustainability plan? So again, as I highlighted, it is trying to identify all the beneficial uses and users in the basin. So that's the who, the administration, who is going to administer this. These are the groundwater sustainability agencies, all new agencies, but largely founded on existing water management agencies, local agencies that were out there before. Some new ones formed. Counties have jumped in. They have that responsibility as well. So we're seeing this aggregate support to really manage water over the basin. And I want to highlight that the compliance point for groundwater sustainability is at the sub-basin or basin level. So it is a broad region. In many of these basins, we have multiple GSAs, we have multiple agencies that are contributing to defining what this is over the basin. And in some instances, we have basins that have multiple GSPs in them. So we can see the layers of complexity increasing as we start to increase the number of GSPs. So the what aspect, we need to define the basin. What are the physical conditions that are occurring in these basins? What's the geologic conditions that are controlling groundwater flow through the basin and contributing to the geochemistry of these waters, such that we can start to evaluate how water quality is tracked through the basin and affected by these management actions. We talked a little bit about the where already, and that's the definition of the sustainable management criteria, those 6 undesirable results and what they mean locally and how they're going to be avoided. The how aspect, this is where FloodMAR comes in. So FloodMAR could be considered a project or a management action within this basin. Now, many individual landowners are considering adopting a FloodMAR practice to help further and support their operations of their land and continue to pump groundwater and replenish the groundwater. And this is a great effort that's very important. But because it's an aggregate over the whole of the basin, I would encourage that these efforts be coordinated with the local agency, the GSA, to better leverage the technical and most importantly, the financial resources that are available through grant processes that we'll discuss a little bit later. So Paul alluded to what we have on our plate right now. We are rapidly approaching the release of our assessments for the first 46 GSPs that were submitted for the 21 basins. So by January of next year, we will have released 21 assessments that will help agencies get on track and align their planning processes to be consistent and move forward with Sigma and reaching their sustainability goals. I did talk a little bit about some of the complexities about multi-GSP basins, and you can see those highlighted in the graphic on the right. We have some basins with upwards of 7 GSPs, and there's specific requirements that come along with taking this approach, and that's the use of consistent and same data, consistent methodology for analysis and same data. So that way we're talking apples to apples across the basin. So when we define a condition in one area, it's the same approach in another area. So we are still looking at the basin scale when we evaluate these plans. It creates an additional layer of complexity because we have to now stitch together 7 some odd plans to help us understand what is the condition in the basin. So those are yet to come, and we're working on these. So the timeline Paul alluded to, this is our ongoing tracking. And so we have annual reports. GSAs are doing a great job submitting annual reports. We're trying to streamline those processes. They're uploading monitoring data, water level data, water quality data. They're uploading their aggregate groundwater extraction data. And this is all very important for us to track that progress towards them meeting their sustainability goals. And then every 5 years, these agencies are required to revisit their plan and provide an update to their groundwater sustainability plans based upon observations they've made over the previous 5 years. Maybe there's changes to how they're defining sustainability. Maybe there's new projects that are coming online. And so we're here to assist throughout this entire process, as well as review these plans moving forward. And just want to tap in there that all along the way, we are expecting continued engagement by the GSAs with the beneficial uses and users in the basin. And then also for us to provide that assistance to those GSAs to keep this moving. We're always open for comments. We always want to hear what's going on in these basins. And so that way we can tailor our assistance role most appropriately to support implementation of Sigma. So now we'll get on to our assistance role. This is really the sweet spot for this talk. And I'll try and touch on these. It's a bit of a smorgasbord. So I want to just provide you some insights. There's a lot of slides here. These will be provided and the links that are embedded in them should be accessible. So I'll work with the committee to make sure that these slides are available to you as a resource and help you tune in on all of the various assistance programs that we have here. So we'll dive in first with the financial assistance. Oh, nope, I'm sorry. We're going to dive in on the outreach and engagement resources. So we have a dedicated web page that you can access and really hone in on all of the opportunities that are available in this sense. So we've produced a series of guidance documents, best management practices. We have virtual meeting guidance and some additional information to help support GSAs and locals to engage in this process and keep Sigma, moving forward with a very open and honest dialogue about how this is being implemented, so people aren't hit blind. And we want to keep supporting the use of best available information and science to support these decision-making processes that agencies are facing. So one of our strong points, and always has been, is DWR's regional offices. And our regional offices, we have Northern region, North Central region, South Central region, and a Southern region. But most specifically, we have dedicated personnel for each of these basins that are attending and paying attention to what's going on at the ground level and reporting this up. So utilize these points of contact with the region offices. Feel free to reach out to them. Feel free to reach out to us at any time. And that way we can inform our program to best support all of the activities that are going on and the challenges that you all face. Again, another strong point, and we have our facilitators here on today and have supported this process all along, but our facilitation support services. The department provides independent facilitation support to really work through these tough decisions that are facing local agencies and the locals currently with Sigma implementation. This is probably one of our most successful programs and is widely utilized, as you can see, as indicated by the map. These are going to continue to be available, and I encourage you to reach out if you're interested or having to negotiate through some challenging decisions, in your GSP implementation, or just as you consider FloodMar or other recharge projects or other projects. These can be really helpful in understanding how this resource can be stretched across as far as possible and support those decision-making processes. Financial assistance. So I will give our financial assistance branch a strong nod. They are doing a fantastic job at administering the grant funding awarded to the Department for Administration from the legislature. I'm going to touch very quickly on some of these high levels, but I would encourage you to reach out more directly to them to understand exactly what the requirements are and timing of getting these funding streams available and useful for you. So I'm not the funding expert, but I want to make sure I'm flagging this for you and you have access to this information. So we've had 3 major grant funding programs thus far since Sigma began back in 2015. The first was implementation of planning grants, and we've awarded over $150 million to local agencies over 3 rounds to help them develop their groundwater sustainability plans. So far, it's looking like it's been pretty successful. We hear everybody's on track to submitting their first GSPs. With the last batch coming in late January of next year. So we should have all of these first steps in groundwater sustainability planning and implementation in-house, and everybody's moving forward on this track, which is a tremendous success in my mind. We've also were awarded $100 million by Prop 68 for implementation grants. And we've awarded several of those grants earlier this year, and they're off and running. And that's really to start to implement some of the projects that were ready to go and really start to move the needle on advancing groundwater sustainability plan implementation. Now, where we're at today. So we have a new solicitation package, a draft solicitation package out that is really supporting this recent budget act just last September that awarded $180 million for Sigma implementation, plus another $60 million to benefit the San Joaquin Valley specifically, and another $60 million for later implementation of Sigma implementation grants in the coming years. So this is the one that we have a draft solicitation package out. on, and it is intended to target both implementation and planning processes, because the legislature acknowledged that while these GSPs have come a long ways, they've also learned a lot, and there's going to be adaptation throughout this process, and these plans will be refined throughout the next 20 years. So this is a great opportunity for agencies to tune in and get that funding necessary to take the next steps. So just to highlight the process, we're looking at approximately 2 rounds being administered through this. The first being 152 million, really targeting those critically overdrafted basins. We are anticipating opening the solicitation in December of 2021. So we're nearing the end of our draft solicitation package and be ready to start posting that and opening the door for applications. And then a second round coming winter of 2022, awarding 205 million to the other high and medium priority basins. So on to the technical assistance. Currently, we've been working very hard on making sure, and Daniel highlighted this early on, that data and information is accessible. And so SB, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the name. Our open data policy, an act that was enacted, really drove us towards the California Natural Resource Agency establishing an open data platform. And so I want to highlight this to you, that this open data platform contains a litany of technical information and data that is provided on a number of our tools, and is really the warehouse for everything that we're going to be producing is going to be posted there and available. Thank you. Thanks, Camiar. AB 1755, the Open and Transparent Water Data Act. Also, we have a strong team developing our DWR GIS Atlas. So we have spatial data that's readily available and able to be linked in and updated and maintained over long term. I want to highlight that, DWR and Sigma have been really targeting those critical data sets that can really lend themselves to supporting Sigma implementation and just water resource management decision-making processes. So one particular project, we have to thank Graham Fogg and Rosemary Knight for bringing this to the attention of the legislature and really bringing this technology to the forefront. With Rosemary's work and collaboration with the Danish government, we were able to conduct pilot tests and really demonstrate the value of this data. We are implementing an airborne electromagnetic geophysical method over the high and medium priority basins of the state from funding from Prop 68. And this is in great thanks to those two in particular who've really kind of been the cheerleaders and make sure that this data was brought to the forefront and the value demonstrated as to how much this can lead to really making informed decisions. From Graham's initial work with his research in looking at incised valley fills, and Rosemary's advancing the geophysical processes, both looking at the geology, but then also looking at water quality with seawater intrusion fronts with her students. So I really am appreciative of all of these folks in pushing this technology along. But I, for one, am very excited about the value of this data. Being a hydrogeologist, one of the most limiting factors for determining what is going on in the subsurface is that interpretation that must be done from the only insights we have to what the subsurface is. We have our borehole data from one borehole to the next, often hundreds, thousands, miles apart from one another, and we're having to make inferences about a sand layer here connecting with a sand layer there. Are they the same? Are they disconnected? Are they connected? This data is allowing us to look at almost a near continuous set of data between those points. And so this is really enabling us to identify those critical recharge areas. And one of the things we heard from the previous speaker was that the GRAT tool is out there and it's a valuable tool, and I totally agree. The challenge with GRAT is it really doesn't understand that deeper geologic connections. And it's this tool that's really going to help us to improve tools like GRAT and others to really talk about full top-down recharge processes and help us identify where those critical recharge areas are. So I'll speak very briefly, and hopefully won't get this wrong, because I'm sure Rosemary will tell me I'm off base. But want to try and highlight just exactly how this technology works. You can see this is a large hoop that contains the geophysical equipment, and it is suspended below a helicopter, approximately 100 feet below the helicopter. The hoop is flown over the land surface, approximately 100 feet off the ground, emits an electromagnetic signal, and receives the bounce back information. The information it's receiving back is a representation of the resistivity of the geological materials that are bouncing that signal back. And what we can do with that is we can see differences in resistivity, clays being less resistive to electric current and sands being more resistive to electric current. We can then correlate those with borehole data and really fine tune what that geophysical signature is saying. So from the cross section, you can see here, oops, I'm already being told time's up. I better fly fast. We can see where those key recharge areas are. The hotter signals here are sands and gravels, prime recharge areas where we have blue clays. Those probably aren't our target areas for floodmar types of areas where we are pushing significant quantities and rates of water, or wanting to push those rates of water into the ground. So I'll wrap up very quickly here, if I can get it to advance. Oh, what is going on? There we go. So again, we're covering all of the high and medium priority basins. This is a course grid and a starting point for this. Hopefully we can advance this and get further down the road. I want to highlight the Sigma Data Viewer. It is a warehouse of a tremendous amount of data, water level information, our well logs, dry well reports. We've been incorporating our subsidence data, and most recently the State Board's Gamma data set for water quality to tie into some of these others. And just a quick key in on Groundwater Live, our updated Bulletin 118 is soon to be released and will be as near as we can get to real-time data. It'll be the most current data you can have, and you can zoom in and filter this data to get as much information about your area to inform the decisions that you're going to be making for implementation of floodmar projects. So that's all I have today. This is just a summary slide giving you some points of contact. And sorry I ran a little long, Daniel, but thank you all.
No, thanks, Tim. That's great. Really great to see how much the department is compiling and pulling together, and the investment in the AEM survey is really a major highlight for a lot of us in terms of having better, newer data. That's great. All right. I didn't see any clarification questions. Again, comments were mostly continuing along discussions from earlier on. So I think, Tommy, if you can go to the next slide, we can shift to introducing Anna, who I believe is the next speaker at this point.
Yes, sir. I'll do it right now.
Great. And as I mentioned, Anna will be talking about the Multi-Benefit Land Repurposing Grant Program. And I've already introduced her from Environmental Defense Fund. There you go, Anna.
Thanks, Daniel, and appreciate the introduction. And thank you to the Floodmar Forum hosts and organizers for inviting EDF to come speak today. It's been a wonderful virtual conference so far, and just really excited to hear about all the impressive work going on. So big thank you to the organizers, fellow panelists, and other speakers here today. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about a new funding program that will be administered by California's Department of Conservation that can help California meet its groundwater objectives, while also helping folks deal with land use change that may come as we are transitioning to sustainable groundwater use. And just waiting for the slides to catch up.
I think you have to move your cursor off the slide itself.
Okay.
It's a pointer when
There
it's
we
on
go.
the slide.
Thank you. So just a brief overview of what I'll be talking through. I'll give a little introduction on Environmental Defense Fund for folks who might be not as familiar with our organization. Then I'll dive into where we're at in California in terms of the drought, sustainable groundwater management, and anticipated land use change. And I'm really excited that we had Tim and Paul share a little bit already today, so I don't have to go too deep into the nitty-gritty of SGMA because they gave such a wonderful overview of the legislation and where we're at in implementation right now. Finally, I'll wrap up by giving an overview of that new funding program I mentioned earlier and how that can be used to support flood managed aquifer recharge projects. Environmental Defense Fund is an international nonprofit that works on some of the world's most significant environmental challenges, ranging from climate and energy, ecosystems, agriculture, oceans, and human health. We take an interdisciplinary approach, relying on science, economics, and advocacy to form partnerships to find collaborative solutions for some of the most complicated environmental issues we face today. I work on Environmental Defense Fund's Resilient Water Systems team, and we really champion this kind of partnership-based approach in our work across geographies in the Western United States. We have programs in Texas, the Colorado River Basin, and California. And in California, we really do focus on sustainable groundwater management as just being a backbone of the state's water resilience and providing that buffer that we really need as we go through pretty extreme swings in precipitation and available surface water supplies. And as many of you are very well aware, I'm sure California is in the midst of another multi-year drought. Despite recent rain events, the entirety of the state still is in drought conditions. This map is from October 26th. So much of the state is still experiencing exceptional and extreme drought. And as Tim mentioned earlier, when the state is in a state of drought, we really do rely on groundwater resources even more so. In a wet year, we may rely on groundwater for about 30 or 40% of our total water supplies. In times of drought, that goes upwards to more like 60%. And we can see the impacts of that on our groundwater levels, particularly as we're experiencing more frequent and intense droughts with climate change. This map on the right shows where groundwater levels are, and those red and deep red dots show areas that are much below normal or at an all-time low. Tim also had some really excellent maps just showing the state and the extent of groundwater overdraft in the state, particularly in some of our agricultural regions in the Central Valley. It was in the midst of another multi-year intense drought in 2014 when the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed and enabled local groundwater users to develop sustainability plans and come up with a path forward to how they may achieve groundwater sustainability. Water managers will be looking, and groundwater sustainability agencies will be putting together projects and management actions to help achieve some of the sustainability goals they set for themselves. And these mainly fall into two buckets. We have supply augmentation, which we've heard much about today and through this week about accessing new surface water supplies and actively recharging aquifers. But particularly in critically overdrafted basins, water managers will also need to look at demand management practices in order to achieve their sustainability goals. In an agricultural context, demand management often looks like irrigation efficiency, conservation, and in some cases, land fallowing is going to be needed. In the San Joaquin Valley, an area that has many critically overdrafted basins, the Public Policy Institute of California estimates that between 500,000 and 750,000 acres of land will need to come out of production in order to meet sustainability targets. This represents, other organizations have estimated upwards of 1 million acres may come out of production. This represents a really significant portion of agricultural lands, between 10 to 20%. And if done as it has in previous drought episodes, what you'll see is land managers making individual decisions, taking land out of production as surface water is available, in kind of a patchwork pattern where there's little coordination or thought to how those lands can be reused. The map on the right is simply a demonstration of what it might look like for landowners to take out of production the least economically productive lands without thoughts around coordination or repurposing. It's very much this kind of patchwork pattern. Looking at it now, I see it kind of looks like an old banana. So maybe not the best color choices, but you can see those areas, the brown spots may be what kind of lands might be followed if looking at this from a pure economic and agricultural production standpoint. However, and with unmanaged land following, many folks may choose to leave lands idle rather than repurposing. And this can pose a significant economic, environmental, and social threat to the region. Public Policy Institute of California also estimated that land fallowing could result in upwards of $5 billion in annual revenue loss from crop production and processing. It could lead to increased weed and pest infestations, causing issues for the remaining lands in production. And it can also contribute greatly to air quality conditions in the valley that is already predisposed to having poor air quality conditions, posing environmental and human health threats to communities that live in the valley. However, there is an alternative. Folks can choose to proactively repurpose lands to new uses that can provide value to the environment or communities through multi-benefit land repurposing practices. This can look a lot of different ways depending on local regions' kind of priorities and preferences for land uses, but some examples include things like managed grazing, dry land crops and cover cropping, including pollinator habitat, solar development to help the state meet its very ambitious renewable energy goals, establishment of parks and recreational space or buffer zones for communities that lack access to sufficient outdoor space at this moment, habitat restoration to create habitat for the dozens of endangered species that live in the San Joaquin Valley. And this can be done in a way that's coordinated to help create wildlife corridors and connect to existing conservation areas. And then very relevant today, recharge projects are also an option for landowners that are taking land out of production. This could take the form of dedicated recharge basins or floodplain restoration, for example. One example actually briefly of what a recharge repurposing project can look like. We are working with an irrigation district in Tulare County that is looking to reduce their groundwater demand and also towards supply augmentation through recharge. The irrigation district purchased 80 acres of land that's currently planted in corn, requiring about 4 acre-feet of water annually. They're going to pull that corn from production and put in its place a recharge basin, a dedicated recharge basin that will be designed to include multi-benefit features to encourage habitat development for migratory waterfowl. So that recharge basin will have slope basin edges, islands, and be planted in vegetation so that can provide forage habitat and nesting habitat for migratory waterfowl. So they're simultaneously reducing the irrigation demand of that parcel while also making an area that can provide multiple benefits and actively recharge the aquifer. This is just a sampling of what repurposing could look like. What all these things have in common is that they have little water demand or actively replenish the basin, and they can help regions achieve their groundwater objectives. While land repurposing sounds like a really promising opportunity, we understand there are certainly limitations to making this happen on the ground. Recognizing this, we got together a group of stakeholders for a 4-part workshop series this past winter. I actually see a number of attendees joining this call today, so thank you very much for those of you who joined those workshops, in which we discussed the major barriers to developing local land repurposing programs that help folks consider alternative uses for land and meet those sustainability objectives. Through those conversations, we also identified some key considerations and opportunities to further land repurposing at a regional and local level. And we synthesized those findings into a white paper that's shown here on the left, Advancing Strategic Land Repurposing and Groundwater Sustainability in California. I'd be happy to drop a link to that if anyone is curious in reviewing it. And some of the key kind of takeaways that folks shared with us is that what's really needed in order to get land repurposing to happen at the scale that we really do need to see it, we need more coordination between water management agencies and land use agencies. Stakeholder input will be critical. This land repurposing will happen on a voluntary basis. So it really needs to be designed in such a way that it's attractive for landowners to participate, recognizing the needs and constraints of growers, while also being aware that land use practices affect neighbors and community members. So providing ample opportunity for rural community members and other stakeholders to weigh in on what their preferences and priorities for land uses are and how to make that happen through incentives or other payment structures is really critical. And of course, funding too is an important piece of the equation as well. There are a number of programs at the state and federal level that could be used for a number of these different repurposing options, but there are limited options that were really focused on this intersection of groundwater savings and land repurposing. So we identified that there is a gap there and some challenges in accessing existing funding. So EDF, for the last couple of years, we've been working on helping to develop a new state funding source that really is focused on land repurposing in the context of SGMA. Earlier this year, Assembly Member Robert Rivas authored AB 252, a bill sponsored by EDF that aims to create a new funding program that can provide payments to landowners for repurposing land to new uses that provide public benefits such as biodiversity enhancement, improved air quality, and recreational and community benefits. Back in September, Governor Newsom passed or signed legislation that will create this multi-benefit land repurposing program and dedicate $50 million to the fund in its first year. The program will be administered by the California Department of Conservation in consultation with the California Department of Food and Agriculture, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Water Resources, and State Water Resources Control Board, recognizing that it is a very interdisciplinary program that touches a lot of different sectors. The structure that we're envisioning is going to take the form of providing block grants to local agencies such as GSAs, counties, local NGOs, or other groups to then in turn provide payments to landowners for voluntary projects that create benefits. The key to the success of the program is going to make sure that it's really flexible and accessible to landowners that want to participate, as well as really taking into account stakeholder input and preferences around different land uses. EDF has been convening a group of stakeholders throughout the process, especially with sponsoring AB 252. We've been in contact with dozens of different stakeholders to hear about what they would like to see in the program, and we're continuing those conversations as we think about guideline development. So if anyone is interested in being involved, please feel free to reach out to me. Department of Conservation will also be hosting stakeholder workshops. There's one scheduled for November 30th and December 2nd. So definitely check out DOC's site for more information about that. And we're really excited to see this program take off. And we're thinking that the guideline development process may take about 6 months or so, and potentially seeing the first solicitation come out maybe summer of 2022. Moving forward, EDF, we're still going to be really focused on collaborative program design and guideline development, really looking also at opportunities to enhance regional coordination. These programs and projects are going to be most successful when there is coordination across the landscape. so we can make sure that repurposing projects are happening in areas where they can be most valuable and provide the most benefits. We're also going to be trying to look for and help support demonstrations of folks that are trying repurposing programs at early stages and highlighting the value that those can bring to an area. $50 million is a great start for the program, but it does not quite match up with the needs. So we're going to need further funding in years to come. And we're also going to need to leverage existing funding sources as well as look to develop new sources at the local and federal level to help support this program and land repurposing at the scale that we need to see it at. That is about all for me for now. Looking forward to the question section later. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Anna. Great work, and especially with the congratulations on the repurposing program and legislative passage of that. That was a great accomplishment. I don't see anybody have any clarification questions. I don't see anything that came up during the talk. So I think we'll wait and hold for bigger questions at the end. All right, so we're going to move on then to our fourth and last speaker, Amanda Montgomery, who's going to talk with us really about some guidance around water rights. And as I've said before, the goal of all of these talks is to get information out there about what is already available, and also spur ideas for maybe what still do we need. So Amanda serves as the Environmental Program Manager for the State Water Resources Control Board's Division of Water Rights Permitting Program. She is the expert on issuing water rights permits statewide, including processing of applications for surface water rights permits focused on recharge. So I know I've learned a lot from her in the last week even about what is available, and I think it's really important for everyone to hear what pathways already exist, because there has been so much perception and concerns about how to get water for recharge. She has 20 years experience at the Water Board and has degrees in ag and soil science. So Amanda, let's hear what you've got.
Great. I need to go back a few slides. I was making sure my forward and back were working. So thank you so much for having me today. I just have so much to say. I'm just going to dive right in. And I've been involved with FloodMAR for a few years, I think, since its infancy. And I'm glad to be here today to talk about water rights permitting. So I tried to gear my slides today up to parties who may be grappling with this question of getting a water right permit for their recharge project. A lot of the GSAs have been moving into the stage of submitting their plans, and I think they're gearing up for that implementation stage. So let's start out with, why do I need it? Why do I need a water rights permit? What is it? So I guess the bottom line is that if a party is planning to capture and store surface water in a groundwater basin for later use, they're going to need some type of appropriative right. And I just right at the beginning say, we view that recharge is basically like a type of storage. So you're putting water underground into underground storage. It's not a beneficial use in and of itself. And we can talk more about that in a moment. So a party would seek a water right permit when they have no other basis of a surface water right to cover their diversion. And we have more information on our website, but riparian claims or rights, those aren't for storage, so they don't work. A party may have the ability to use a pre-1914 water right, and if they have that available to them, they should investigate it, likely with a water rights attorney, to see what they've got and how it might cover their project. Those type of rights were established before the year 1914 and then continuously used since. So they may be trading off some use that they've already been doing for this new activity. Those type of rights, when they make a change, they do that under Water Code 1706. So that doesn't require a petition to the State Water Board. Those parties do generally file statements of their diversion and use with the State Water Board, unless say they're an adjudicated basin, and then a water master might file that report for them. If they have a If there's a post 1914 right already out there, a permit or a license that a party is thinking about using, then you look to see what that right covers, what its bounds are, what its rate is, where it allows the water to be used. And that might be a possibility too. And so parties can look into that. If they're going to be using a post 1914 right, they're most likely involving a water right change petition with the State Water Board, because they're probably adding some points of diversion or rediversion, or adding the place of use where the water is used. But say none of those work, and a party says, well, I want to take surface water. What's their avenue? The avenue is a water rights permit. So a water rights permit is a permission to divert and use surface water. It's issued by the State Water Board, Division of Water Rights. Standard applications, which are permanent water rights, set a priority date. And that's really important in appropriative water rights, because the way they work is the first in right is the first in time. So if you think about cups of water, the first cup of water, that cup gets completely filled up before the next person's cup of water is filled up. So priority date's really important. And a water right sets the quantity, the rate, and the season of diversion. And those can't expand after filing. So I just take a little side road there to mention that we do have a fact sheet on climate change and water rights permitting. And one message in that fact sheet is about considering climate change, because you may want to design your project based on the climate change scenario, in part because you might think that there might be higher flows than we're seeing right now in the time of year that you might be targeting, because there might be more rainfall events and less snow events. But when you set your quantity, rate, and season, you can't expand it after you file. So it's important pre-filing step. Let me go on the next slide. Okay, so what's the process? Kind of 10,000 foot level, what's the process? So the first thing is that water rights permits aren't just for diversion, they're also for the use of the water. And it's beneficial use. And so we do have fact sheets on the beneficial uses and underground storage. That gets to my first point about, for us, putting water underground is underground storage, and then how will the water be used? And that fact sheet talks to different ways. So there could be ways that are involved in the water staying in the basin, and helping with things like subsidence and helping with maybe domestic wells and that sort of thing. So there's space there for in situ for the water to stay in the aquifer to serve those purposes. And then there's also the more traditional route, which is extraction. So that might mean that the permit water is extracted out, and then maybe some of the other water that's not related to the permit stays in the basin. And water might be extracted out for all number of uses, irrigation, municipal, there's lots of them. And then we also have a fact sheet on sole purpose flood control diversions, and that's to help explain that flood control, traditional flood control, diverts water out of channels, not for beneficial use, but simply for like alleviating that harm condition at the moment. So when it's only for that purpose, it's not actually a beneficial use. But you know, these days we're talking about multi-benefit and flood control, and so you're diving into the world where you're overlapping between being for flood control and also being for recharge. And so when you have it be for recharge and you have it be for serving beneficial uses, then you start to dive into the world of some type of water rights coverage, which here we're focusing on permits. So if you get into the permit process, there's multiple steps, and we've been doing permitting since 1914. You know, it's a well-honed process. It involves multiple steps, involves public process. So the steps are, we go through an acceptance process to see if there's all the pieces are there with the application. There's a reasonable likelihood of water is available on the front end. We do a public notice, and parties in the public can protest and raise their concerns. Protests are very common in water rights and bring up a number of issues that need to be worked out through the processing. Environmental protests are very, very common on water right permits. And then showing water's available for the project, which is called water availability analysis. It's a discretionary action to issue a water rights permit, so CEQA. The consideration of public trust that comes from past legal actions. And it's basically about, you know, that trade-off between taking water out of a stream for human needs and the needs of the stream itself for fisheries and other purposes. And then accounting. So the surface water is put underground. So, you know, how is it being stored there? And then how is it either staying in the aquifer or coming out, that tracking, and then preparing the draft permit. And a draft permit contains terms and conditions under which the water right operates. And when a permit is issued, I know people get permits probably think, woof, I'm done. But the permit is just it's a permission to try to develop a project. A permit actually has a development period, which lasts a certain number of years. That can vary, say, could be 15 years, for example. And during that period of time, the party shows what they can do with what they've been granted. And then at the end of that, they receive that data is later used to grant a license. And a license is actually the firmed up water right. That's where you're kind of saying, this is what I showed that I used. And parties who can't get done in their development period can get an extension called a time extension. Okay, so in water rights permitting, we've really been focusing on streamlining efforts since SGMA came online. And that really ramped up in about 2015. And so in 2015, water rights permitting, we're short-staffed, but we carved out some of our staffing and really started working on this issue since. And our first efforts were something called a 180-day temporary permit. We had fee reductions for that. We were coming out of that, not the drought we're in now, but the last drought. Coming out of that, we reduced our fees for the 180 days to try to spearhead, you know, that as a pathway. And some parties took us up on that, kind of our early adopters. And during that same period of time, we really started thinking about how can we create a streamlined pathway? And it took various forms, but it took us a number of years. And you'll see, we released our streamlined pathway in 2019. So there's about 4 years of effort there. Lots of talk. Aqua was very important in those discussions, and many other parties. We reached out to a lot of stakeholders trying to figure out, could we have a streamlined pathway through? And we released that in December 2019. And I'm going to talk more about it. During that same period of time, I mentioned we were looking at all kinds of streamlined pathways. Another opportunity that came through for a streamlined pathway was a 5-year temporary permit. And so that legislation went through and went active in 2020. And so those two streamlining efforts, I'm going to talk more about them in a minute. In 2021, so this year, with no new staffing on our side, we have been kind of reshuffling our staffing a bit. We have a unit senior who's now an engineering geologist, our first engineering geologist, unit senior in permitting. We usually have engineers and scientists, but we're gearing up to be more nimble with recharge issues. And then that senior's been able to hire his staff. And I'll talk about at the end how they each have kind of a geographic area that they're covering so that we can be more available for questions as GSAs as they're gearing up with their projects. Okay, keep going. So what type of permit do I apply for? It's like a big question. And I look at all the options as kind of tools in the toolbox, and they actually go together. So temporary permits, 180-day, 5 years, doesn't matter. They're basically one of two things. They're either, if you have a short-term project that has no chance of moving forward and being long-term, which I think is probably pretty rare in SGMA because people are looking for water long-term. But if you had a short-term project, it can be just serve that. It can be kind of a one and done. But the strength of a temporary permit with these SGMA projects is a bridge while the processing the standard permit. So they don't really replace the need for the standard permit. And that's actually really clear in the code that if you have a project that's long-term, you need to be focusing on the standard permit. You can use the temporary permit to get you started, but really their strength is running while your standard permit is processing. And the standard permits provide that permanent continuing coverage for authorization of the water right. So let's talk about some example strategies. And everybody has a different situation. They're going to have a different strategy. But if you knew your project scope, which is, you really have to know your project scope to come to us because we're going to ask a lot of questions about exactly how it all works. You know that, and SEEK was done. So if you had that, at the same time you filed your standard application, and I'm going to assume it's streamlined. We'll talk more about that, but could be non-streamlined. But you'd file your standard application streamlined, and at the same time file your 5-year temporary permit application. And so you could get approval for those 5 years while your streamlined standard application is processing. And then the next example that I have is, say you know your project scope, but you may need to adjust it. There's just some things you're working out, right? You maybe have a broader scope, then you're going to narrow it down, whatever it is. And so you say, I need to have this one, this initial pilot phase. So there you might file 180 day for the first year to test out the project. And then in your second year, you could be ready to file your standard application and your 5-year temporary permit. We did have some people who filed 180 day year after year. We're moving those people away from that. Now we have the 5-year. And if they're doing that, more than a couple of years, really they're telling us, hey, this is most likely going to be a permanent project, unless they tell us no, it really has this set end date. Okay. Another thing that I just wanted to throw in here is some people might say, well, I'm going to talk about the streamlined pathway. You might say, I don't know about the streamlined pathway. I want to do the standard pathway. So one thing to think about with the streamlined and the standard pathway is that the streamlined pathway of for a permanent water right, it overcomes a lot of the factors that make permitting take such a long time and have such complexity for the party. And so a party might think about saying, well, I'll get the streamlined permit for that period of time. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then maybe for the shoulder seasons where the streamline doesn't cover it, they might want to just pursue like another permit that covers that period of time, because that's more of kind of more intensive timeline, kind of different types of analysis and work intensity. And there's less assurance that you'd actually be able to receive that. Old school water right permitting applications would apply for broad seasons without a lot of upfront commitments to kind of restrictions, and then they get whittled back over long periods of time. So the streamlined pathway presents an opportunity to not have to go through those years of back and forth. Okay. Try to get my slide to advance. It's a little stuck. Okay, there we go. So this has a lot of information on it. I'm not going to go through it all. But what it does show is some of the things I've already been talking about. So what are the tools in the toolbox? So you've got the 180 day, you've got the 5-year. Those are both temporaries. Neither of those confer a priority date. So, that's not going to get you, it gets you an authorization to divert. It doesn't really get you like a water right in the sense of having a priority date. Somebody else comes in, with the temporary, they also don't have a priority date. What parties are really probably looking for in SGMA is standard permits where they can secure their priority date and know where they are relative to the other people in the system about their priority to divert. So within the standard permits, we've got the streamlined and then the standard permit. So what's the best use? We talked about that. I'm not going to go through it again. Water availability, you do water availability no matter which of those tools you pick. Water availability for 180 day may be more focused on immediate conditions because you're asking for this, this whatever winter you're in. But still, the same kinds of questions are coming up. The fastest water availability by far is going to be the streamlined pathway. CEQA generally applies, who can apply. So some of our tools are really targeted at GSAs or local public agencies as defined by SGMA. That's the 5-year and the streamlined standard permit. And the public is engaged no matter which of the tools you pick. And there's divert reporting and accounting. That's all required no matter which one you pick. Okay. Sorry, my slides are a little slow when I push the button. Try again. There we go. So how do I apply? So there's an online portal for all the different temporary standard permit application types. They're all use the exact same portal. And my tips before you file is to please reach out for a pre-filing consult with board staff. We can help talk you through it and give you some tips. I would do that quite a bit ahead because there are pieces, work that you would do before you apply. Also, we encourage parties to outreach with senior diverters in their watershed to explain their project and to engage with CDFW. And you may be able to hear their concerns and address that in your project design. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly show what some of our website looks like. We have lots and lots of content on our website if you're interested. We have 180-day temporary permit website. All of our websites kind of have the same format where we have different tabs to talk about different topics. There's tips, there's information on beneficial use, on the application package, on the findings that we'll need to make. So we'll need that information from the party who's applying, information on water availability, CEQA, accounting, fees, and forms. And this 5-year, same format, walks through the 5-year. The standard streamlined pathway website, we have a website for that. I'm going to go into more detail now on the streamlined pathway. And the reason why I'm focusing there is it is kind of the fast way through. You know, Daniel was mentioning, hey, we may need a pathway here. You know, we've put a lot of time into that and we have it. So I'd like to see people take advantage of it. To date, no one has applied for a 5-year temporary permit, which did only come online in 2020, and no one has applied for the standard streamlined pathway. And very few people, just a couple, have applied for standard permitting, and they're going into the many-year process. So let's talk about streamlined and some of the benefits of that. So streamlined has 5 basic kind of like tenets. Who it applies to, it's based on a simplified water availability analysis, use and storage accounting in the GSP, umbrella permitting, and fees. So who does it apply for? It's a basin that's in the Bolton 118 basin. The applicant is a local agency, GSA, or another local agency as defined by SGMA. CEQA is complete at the time of application, so we can move it forward. And it uses a simplified WAA, water availability analysis. And the cornerstone of the streamlined pathway is diversion from December to March. And I know some parties will say, well, I want to divert outside December to March. You could apply for a standard permit. You could have that be a second action that you do. I would say that December and March, you might say, well, my watershed is coming at these other times. I would say, well, those other times, the fisheries needs are going to take a lot more investigation to know what they need of that water that you're seeing. And then the senior diverter needs are also going to take a lot more examination. So you can go that pathway. It's just, it requires a lot more work. So let's talk about the simplified water availability analysis, because that's really the cornerstone to this streamlined pathway. So there's 2 options here. So one option is based on the gauging information that's available in the watershed where you're going to divert. And most of our big watersheds have gauges, and those gauges, most of them have 30 years or more record. And so you can look on the USGS gauge for that gauge, and you can see the 90th percentile. So those are when that individual day, when the flows are, above the 90th percentile for that day. So really high flows, right? But it's a statistical thing and it's available. And then also limiting diversion to 20% of the daily flow. And then we do a check downstream to make sure that when we add up the senior diverters on the flow path, that the 90% is meeting their needs. That is a much, much simpler analysis than normal water availability. Normal water availability is done based on points of interest or points of analysis at set locations at a point of diversion, and then at representative locations in the downstream flow path all the way to the terminus in a bay or ocean. And we look at the entirety of the watershed that drains to that point. We look at unimpaired flow data, and we minus out the in-stream needs, which usually need to be determined on a case-by-case basis, unless a flow objective has been established in that watershed, which is fairly rare. And so that case-by-case basis usually requires the applicant to hire consultants to look at what does that stream need at that location. So that can be, it's a site-specific study for in-stream needs. And then also senior diverters, you're getting very large numbers when you're looking at the entire watershed. But we do need to make sure when we give out water rights that we're only giving out new water when it's above the in-stream needs and the water that's already been committed to senior diverters. So that's option number 1, the 90th percentile, 20% from December to March. The next option, also December to March, is to divert when flood conditions threaten health and safety based on a flood control agency's written criteria. And this one, there's flexibility in this. We look to the flood control agencies, perhaps in partnership with the state agency, to help them to come up with this written documentation and present it to us as this option. But it really dovetails well with FloodMar. We haven't had a party come to us yet with this, but I think there's a lot of coordination that can be done on this option through the streamlined pathway. And I'm kind of excited to see what can happen with it. Okay. There we go. Okay, so the next part of the streamlined pathway is use and storage accounting. And so we're hoping, because these projects on the streamlined pathway are running through the GSP or the GSA or the local public agency, that it can be part of the accounting can be from what they're developing for their GSP. I think that's would be the most integrated with the overall basin. We want to know, how is the surface water sitting in the groundwater aquifer and then being taken out or staying there? If it's staying there, it's probably not all staying there. It's probably having some degradation to deep perk or to other lateral movement. There are other ways to do it if a party couldn't figure out something with their GSP, but that's our hope. Okay, and then umbrella permitting. So that's really going back to this idea of a GSA being the applicant, that they could cover larger areas and have a consolidated place of use. And if a party's thinking about doing this, then we advise them to talk to us early, because there is certain constraints within the water code with this, but the idea is it's much more efficient to have a larger entity, especially if it's a GSA where they're already managing the basin, to be administering the water right and kind of taking care of that, all those reporting and working with the state water board, rather than having a whole bunch of individuals do that and being less efficient. And then the last part is fees. So we do, for parties who are going the streamlined pathway for standardized permitting, we reduced our fees several years ago by 25%. We are fee funded. We don't get general fund for managing water rights permitting. So we're doing this reduction with the assumption that parties are going the streamlined pathway, and by doing that, they are, it's going to be a faster process all around for the applicant and for us, because we're having that water availability criteria set up front. And also within the reduced fees is this idea that even after the permitter license is issued, that the fee is less. And it's kind of an innovative structure there, because we recognize that these permits are going after water that may not be there every year. They're probably there in wet years or during these wet events. So they can pay less than their 100% fee amount. They can go down to 75% if they divert less than their face value, which is the amount authorized in the right. So if you're thinking about filing a recharge application, I did mention that we have the unit staff now have areas that they're covering. And so you can reach directly out to the staff or the unit senior. We have a staff person for that Sacramento River area, for the kind of lower San Joaquin River, the middle upper San Joaquin, the Tulare Lake, the Central Coast of Southern California, and then everywhere else we have the unit senior. So those staff are looking for opportunities to maybe go out and talk to groups if people want to hear more about permitting, and are open to talk about potential projects. So that's my last slide.
Great, Amanda. You generated a lot of interest and questions. I think there's a couple that are going to be sort of quick clarification questions. Several of them are going to be much more in-depth discussion items. I think there was, let's see, there was some questions about fees, and Shelby from the State Board also sent out an answer to that. So I'm hoping that that will be covered there. There was, let's see, just trying to look at some of the simpler ones. There was, yeah, they're all challenging, I think. There was one about, let's look at this. Yeah, there's several discussion about use of climate change, given the attention to flooding and changing flooding, and Kamyar commented that for the simplified approach, can climate change model results be used to determine the 90th percentile flow diversion threshold? And
well, I think we'd have to think about that. I mean, the simplicity of the 90th percentile is so the 90th percentile is always changing. So it's looking 30 years back, but that 30 years is a sliding value, right? So every year you move forward, you're going back a different number, it's it's not reaching back as far. The strength of the 90 percentiles, it's readily available. Parties can just go onto USGS and kind of, it's like green, red almost designation. There's that 20% that has to be separately calculated, but it's pretty easy. To do it with climate change would be more tricky. So you would have to, climate change factors into water availability as the unimpaired flow data. That probably fits best into the type of analysis that you do when you do standard water availability analysis. But there might be some way with the 90th percentile. We could talk about that. It's just, it's the strength of 90% is that it's readily available data, right? A party can just look on the USGS website and see what their number is.
Yeah. There seem to be a number of questions about the incidental recharge, or and when you think about beneficial use, and the accounting that you discussed, the fact that a lot of the recharge projects now are for not just for later pumping, but have other Sigma intended purposes. How does the accounting work on those, where water that's going to be applied will not all be pumped and will be left behind?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that we're hoping that this can all be integrated together, both for just like long-term viability of the systems, and the GSP accounting plans are tracking, in a general sense, not molecule for molecule, but in a general sense, what water is sitting there in the basin. And so our hope is that those accounting plans for the GSP can account for water that is going to be sitting in the basin, in the aquifer, and not being used by others and serving this purpose, whatever that purpose is. Say it's subsidence, right? So I think that would be the strongest point, because otherwise it gets complicated if someone tries to take that water out, right? Say under their overlay right or something, without the GSP kind of being involved in that in some sense.
Okay. Other questions related to the 90th percentile. We talked about the climate change aspect of that, and retrospective for 30 years. How does, since that 90th, is the 90th percentile a quantity that's locked in, or is it continue to evolve, for instance, as upstream management of reservoirs changes and releases are different because of FIRO operations?
Yeah, it does change. So the 90th percentile, when we were thinking about it, we were in the beginning, during those 4 years we were developing our approach, we said, oh, should we lock it in? That might be easier. You got a set number. We were like, but there's no set. We want to be reflective of how it changes. So it changes because it's always reaching back 30 years from that moment, right? But it doesn't change quickly because you've got 30 years worth of data.
Okay. Let's see. I want to make sure we get back to some of the other folks. I think we'll come back to water rights. I know we could spend the rest of this half hour or 15 minutes that are left on water rights, but I did want to just give a chance for some of the other folks, the questions that came up for them to get addressed. And for those items, some of the questions that came up for Anna, there were some questions about are there decision support tools and other resources for landowners considering land repurposing such as alternative land uses, when and where those options make sense, and who will assist landowners in evaluating, designing those repurposing actions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you, Jenny, for posing that. There are several groups that have been thinking about land repurposing and some of those more specific options as well. So folks have been more focused on habitat, or more focused on recharge, or more focused on solar. So there are a number of different groups that have been thinking about that and developing resources and guidance. I referenced the most comprehensive that I know of is in the white paper that we developed. We have an appendix that kind of outlines the various different guidance materials that are out there on land repurposing options. And we have a big section too about support for stakeholder engagement in those decision-making processes as well, and how to involve community members and local landowners in discussions about land use and water use jointly. So yes, I can forward around that link. I'll also just give a quick shout out to the Nature Conservancy that has done a lot of work around upland habitat potential in the San Joaquin Valley, as well as some work around solar siting. there's, sorry, I'm blanking on the organization, but another group has done some work on low conflict solar siting in the San Joaquin Valley. Sustainable Conservation, of course, has done a lot of work around recharge and thinking more about recharge in through a multi-benefit lens as well, which is really helpful when we're thinking about land repurposing. And then also, I guess, point folks to their local conservation groups. Tulare Basin Watershed Partnership is an excellent group working in the Tulare Basin watershed and identifying priority areas for conservation activities. And there's a great group of people involved in that network that can help with siting and planning and accessing resources, as well as groups like the Sequoia Riverlands Trust, local land trust that also has a really excellent grasp on conservation opportunities in the region. Yeah, so that's just kind of off the top of my head, some resources that might be available for folks. Thanks for the question.
Great to see all the various parties that are working on this. Another related question for you on land repurposing is the question about net water use reduction. If the goal is to, for Sigma purposes, it's being taken out of production, yet some of the uses such as wetland vegetation, riparian restoration, and we've even heard about cover cropping for dust control. All of these have a water use element, and especially in districts where or basins where ET is being used as the measure of consumptive use. How is that going to be looked at, or is there an exemption?
Right, that's a great question as well. And I think it's important when thinking about land repurposing, one of the main objectives really is to avoid unintended consequences associated with idled lands. So with repurposing options, there will oftentimes be some sort of vegetative cover or something to protect the soils, keep dust emissions down, and avoid weed and pest establishment. So the net consumptive use of the the consumptive use of the property likely won't go completely to zero. There will probably be some water demand that, ideally it's something closer to, 10 inches a year, or it's something that can be sustained by rainfall alone. In other cases, you might have a use that can require some applied water for establishment of vegetation or to get the project going. And other uses might need more regular water supplies. For example, some of those recharge alternatives, those will be bringing in water, and some of that water will be used by vegetation, especially if you're managing basins in a multi-benefit way to support habitat. There might be some consumptive use. So it might not be, a zero water demand, but it's going to be less than the alternative, especially when you think about a lot of the crops that are grown in the San Joaquin Valley, a very high water demand. So these alternatives will certainly have less than that and help make progress towards that demand reduction goal. And then I'll also just really quickly note on cover crops in particular, as well as some of these other land uses, they maybe have, a consumptive use, they have evapotranspiration, but that's just one part of the equation of how they're affecting the water budget. So for things like cover crops where there's some really strong soil health benefits that can help with retention and recharge of water as well. So there's, a positive contribution to the water budget there, and thinking about the net effect of that rather than just, the consumptive ET.
There's a lot of other questions. I'm hoping some of these can get covered in the breakout session. I do want to ask a sort of more integrative question for all of you. Since this is part of the FLEDMAR network effort, we'd like to find out what sort of coordination is needed to carry the messages that you all are working on, both the guidance, the funding, the technical assistance. What do you see the role for the FLEDMAR network in helping either fill data gaps or coordinate outreach? There's so many efforts going on. Is there a role for the network that you would recommend? Tim, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll jump in. Yeah, just the existence of this network is tremendously valuable for connecting the dots between all of these programs. I mean, you heard from me talking about our regulatory program, the technical assistance we're offering, when we heard from Amanda and the regulatory program that she oversees with the water rights system. And I think just right there, just making those connections about the data necessary to support water right permitting and to move agencies through, these are some very simple things to close the gap, but I think Jenny mentioned this morning, it's like DWR has always been kind of, very eager to help, but not wanting to get in the way. And I thought that was a really good way of stating it. With Sigma, DWR has kind of been thrust in the way a bit, but we're still in that mode where we want to help, but we need to understand where the locals need that help to provide that information. I think so a network like this, in communicating those needs and really honing in on how to efficiently work through those problems, I think really informs us all in terms of how we adapt. And thinking about the work that Anna's doing, I think that's really pertinent here. How do we connect the dots for land transition to support ecosystem or flood benefits, flood recharge benefits? There's a lot of ways, a lot of points that we can connect the dots. So yeah, I think just the existence of the FloodMar network is extremely valuable. I think there's still a need to reach out beyond this and to really get down to landowners, to the GSAs, bringing all these parties together to start to develop a more coordinated plan to address this transition period we're really looking at.
Thank you. Other panelists want to respond to the question of how the network can be used to fill gaps or extend outreach and coordinate what we're all doing here to support our landowners?
I would definitely reflect what Tim was saying, that they're definitely just being able to connect with each other and understand what everyone is doing is key. And I think in that same kind of vein, collaboration is really key, and having all of the voices at the table, and importantly, having people on the ground who are doing work talk to each other and kind of working out and figuring out what works in practice, what parts of guidance are and are not feasible, and then how can that inform our guidance recommendations. And I think having a central hub to do that and connect with each other is really important.
Great.
And this is Amanda, I would just throw in, I echo, so much has been said that I agree with. I would say one area of strength that maybe hasn't been mentioned is LunchMar. So, for my staff, my permitting staff, we look to learn as much as we can about recharge so we can be best informed when the applicants come to us. And so I think LunchMar is very valuable to us in that sense for kind of broadening our understanding and events like this forum. And then also we've been able to participate in LunchMar and reach a broader audience that way. So we've really appreciated that process and hope it keeps going.
Great. And I could certainly see Amanda taking a full hour for what we had you cover in 20 minutes there in further depth. I think there's a lot more questions on that. Anna, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, mostly just echoing thoughts of others, other panelists have shared, but yeah, just underscoring that it's a tremendous ecosystem of information and work being done. And it can be really, difficult to get your head around all the different efforts underway. So just having a place where you can learn more about, who's doing what and put faces and names to different projects, I think is so helpful to opening doors for communication, which is just so vital to actually getting projects on the ground and getting things to happen. So I really appreciate that aspect of the FloodMar network.
Great.
Just real quick, Daniel,
yeah.
One thing that we've been hearing through our outreach and engagement is the concern over trust and building of trust. And I think it's hubs like this that trust can start to form, and we can, reach out further and really work collectively to solving some of these problems, and not be putting it on any one entity as a sole responsible party. And I think that's a piece that's missing that I see being, grown here very well. And I think that's just something that I wanted to echo, that we've been hearing from various inputs, that's a big piece that's missing. And so I hope that we can start to build that.
Great. Any comments on the funding side in terms of accessible funding? Tim, you presented a whole variety of different funding resources. Anna, you've talked about the new Department of Conservation funding. NRCS has been mentioned as having funding for project implementation. What are there gaps where you all see funding needed more strategically, or as I was talking about earlier, that allows for integrated project design? And Kamyar put a message in the chat about the availability now of the, I don't have it right in front of me, but there's now a more integrated state funding mechanism, the enhanced infrastructure financing districts that have been approved, enable knitting together of multiple funding sources. Do you folks see those programs coming to be and becoming available? Or do you have specific funding needs that you think are still gaps for landowners and water districts? I know that's
Well, I can jump in very quickly. I mean,
yeah.
Unfortunately, the state grant function, has some set rules as to how these funds are released and intended to support, and that's generally through these local agencies. So again, there's a need to leverage groups like this to build that trust with local agencies even, and build localized networks that those funds can support a broader, more diverse group of actions. And I think there's a gap here. While we say go do good things with this planning and implementation money, there's not a lot of constraints on what that looks like. And what I'm hearing in this group is that there's a need to coordinate how we make investments into the future to optimize the opportunities in front of us. So I think there's some planning necessary to help us kind of align, and I think this group is focused on that planning, and I think it will help to inform future state funding opportunities. So I encourage this to continue, but yeah, just an observation.
That's great. Yeah, the prioritizing or ranking of funding to achieve specific multiple benefits as opposed to just being funding for all sorts of different types of projects that might have occurred anyway. Yeah, that's great. Just have a few minutes left. I had hoped to have time for audience conversations, but there were so many good questions already in the chat that we didn't have any opportunity. I think we'll do the in-person conversation in the breakout. Amanda, maybe one more for you in here. Actually, this is probably more than a 3-minute question. Let's see, I'm just going to try and grab one of these. There was a question, actually Kamyar talked about this, about the permissible flood flow diversion thresholds. I guess you said that's a simpler route, but at the same time, I guess, although it's probably important to identify the flood flow diversion thresholds, how often do you think that that's actually a practical route to go, given the multiple benefits approaches that most recharge ends up serving?
Are you talking about single-use flood control? Oh,
right.
So single-use flood control is like the traditional before recharge was really focused on, right? And that's this concept that there was these projects out there, or these not projects, but just actions out there that were being taken to alleviate, human harm from flooding. And I guess that's very traditional. So it doesn't seem like when you're interacting with that and FloodMar, where you're really focusing on recharge, that you're using that pathway. I think our fact sheet was pointing out that pathway exists for those true single-use flood control actions. When you start to talk about multi-benefit, which is the name of the game, right? I mean, everything's multi-benefit now. You're really looking at a water right permit to cover that, unless you have some other basis of right to cover it, because you're having beneficial uses of the water that's being put into the aquifer. And that's where, like I talked about the streamline pathway, the streamline pathway, one of the two diversion criteria would be based on written criteria of a flood control agency. So I think that pathway exists. And like I mentioned, I think it's an exciting pathway to explore and to see what can be done with that.
Great, thank you. So much more to talk about here for all of these topics. Arit, I think maybe I should hand it back to you. And first, thank you, all the panelists, Taylor, Anna, Tim, and Amanda, for your presentations, and hope you will stay in the breakout sessions and be part of those conversations as well. And I will just say that the breakout sessions really is also a chance for the participants to think about what all this means to them as well, and to talk about that. So Arit, I'll hand it to you.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Yes, what a hard thing to stop, but as we know, this is one of many conversations that we're going to continue and have moving forward. So, and you know, Daniel, as you were posing the question about the network, I can imagine a new network initiative of creating that toolbox where some of the monitoring and data tools and decision support tools and information is something that the network can create, that toolbox or hub for people to connect with as all this great efforts are going on. So we have a Mentimeter because we do want you to weigh in and give us your thoughts, even if it's not in conversation. So how can you use the guidance or assistant that we discussed today that you heard about in your work? We would love to hear from you. Were you making a connection to that? And we're also going to get into 4 breakouts. So this is just a way to connect with others and share your thoughts about what you just heard. So let's get into the breakout session, and this will go on until 12:30. And then we are going to reconvene at 1 o'clock for our lunch keynote speaker. So thank you again, everyone. Great presentations. Thanks, Daniel, for trying to contain the conversation to the time that you were given. And looking forward to more conversations with everyone. So Tommy, we'll let you send us off.
And I have it so folks can move rooms. You can come back to the main room if you need to. I actually set up 5 rooms already, and we have the panel, 1 in each room. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up now. Hi, Adam. I see you in here. Adam has left. Okay.
Hey, Tommy, Amanda and I
Yeah.
are joining another room.
Okay.
The other participants in our room were just empty spaces.
Okay.
I
Yeah,
think,
we were both in one, and I don't know what happened with one.
yeah.
There was a bunch of people in there.
Well, it
Yeah,
got,
we
it got
lost some
smaller and
people.
smaller.
Yeah, we lost some people and no one turned on their cameras or mics, so we were just chatting and we figured we would just join another group.
Oh, there's Mike Conway. He came in over here.
I am here. I was
What
juggling
happened in-
between phone and computer, and
It's
Oh, no.
okay. We were just in one, and like there was getting smaller and smaller. So we're like, okay.
Do you want?
I was,
Do you want to?
cruising around. You know.
Yeah. Do you want to? Do you want to go to another room? Or you should be able to choose go into another room. I have that option on there.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just gonna pop into another room then. And
Okay.
get the conversations going.
And it is screen shared, the Mentimeter on there. So if any point you want me to pull it down, just let me know.
Okay.
There doesn't
Do you want
look
us to
like.
go to breakout rooms and then just choose one? Is that
Yeah.
how it works? Oh, okay, perfect. I didn't know we had so much control. Awesome.
Yeah. I made it. Well, especially as you all as co-hosts can float around wherever you want. So
Oh, okay.
All right.
yeah.
Thank you.
No
Thank
problem.
you.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you, Jenny. Thanks for coordinating, and well done, Amanda. Of course.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, I'm gonna pick a room.
All right.
Give me a room.
Okay.
Yeah. And then same thing, Mike, if you want to pop into another room, you're more than welcome to.
Sure. Thank you very
I
much.
should be able to. If you can't, you should be able to open the breakout rooms and see who's in what.
Yeah. Okay.
I can assist though as well if needed.
Let me play around with it here.
Okay. Yeah, you were in one. There you go. Oh, nope. I'll just move them to 2. There you go.
Well, thanks, everyone. I know some of you were cut halfway in your sentence. So let's take our break and we'll continue at 1 o'clock. We'll see you at 1 o'clock. Thanks, everyone. And Tommy, just to make sure we're letting everybody know, we're asking them to join in again. Are you closing this or are you leaving this open? You're muted.
There we go. So yeah, so we're going to leave because we our keynote speaker Dirk is going to check in. So we're going to get him checked in first, and then we'll allow everybody to come back in at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting and so grab some lunch. And as Arit said, this is a working lunch, right? So grab your lunch and then come back on, and we'll hear our keynote presentation. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and end it now. Just got to move some stuff around on my screen.
Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome. And we'll see everybody here in a little bit. Again, go through the attendee hub to come back into the session.